Hey everybody, welcome back to another Stereo Launch video, and today we're going to be answering the age-old question, do I have to change my strings and put on new strings when I record my acoustic guitar? So today we're going to do kind of a shootout here between old strings and new strings. I have my trusty Seagull M6 acoustic guitar. I've had this thing forever, 17, 20 years, can't remember exactly. Bought it used for like 300 bucks. So this is not a high-end acoustic guitar. This is kind of just a budget-friendly acoustic guitar. I also have the Audio-Technica AT4040. It's a large diaphragm condenser microphone. Again, not super high-end. I think they go for about 300 bucks new. So budget-friendly home studio mic for the most part. About 10, 12 inches away from the guitar and at the 12th fret. Just kind of a standard, general, get a good sound with one microphone setup here. As far as the strings, these strings are about 3 months old, something like that. Again, I don't play a ton of acoustic guitar, so they're not completely worn out or anything like that. I play it some, and then it sat for a month or whatever, and then I play it a little bit more. So they're not completely worn out. They still sound good enough for practicing and playing at home and all that good stuff. But we're going to see if they sound okay enough for now. Is it worth putting on new strings for the recording time? So what I'm going to do is basically play a few things with these old strings. Then I'm going to change out the strings, put new strings on, and play those same things and try to play them as close to the same as I can and kind of do an A/B comparison. And make sure you keep watching after that, because I'm going to share my thoughts and opinions on the new strings versus the old strings, and then also share some of my experience as far as recording myself as well as other songwriters in the studio. And sometimes we use new strings and sometimes we use old strings, and kind of the pros and cons of new strings versus old strings. Well, I got a chance to listen back to those a little bit and kind of compare both examples. And one common theme that I heard was that the old strings had more mid-range and more low mids, and the new strings had quite a bit more high end in articulation in general. And honestly, that's kind of what we'd expect. And when we change our strings and our guitars, especially if it's been a while, then we kind of hear, with our ears that, wow, my guitar sounds a lot brighter and more lively, generally speaking. So that's not unexpected. Now, listening a little more critically and more detail, I could hear several different things. So on the first example that I played, right, that part, on those lower notes, with the old strings, there was definitely more bass, more low end on that. So that was kind of nice in a way, but there wasn't as much clarity in the picking between all the notes. With the new strings, there was definitely more clarity between the different notes, and even on the low notes, I could distinguish them better. I could hear them better as they changed, even though maybe not quite as much low end. So again, I think just in general, the new strings, much more top end, probably 5, 6, 8, 10K, all that stuff, that really high end stuff, which gives it that more articulation. And then the old strings, there's more mids and low mids and all that stuff. So which one is better? Well, it really kind of depends on what you're wanting to get. I'm going to say 98% of the time for what I record, I'm going to put new strings on the guitar because that articulation and all that stuff is really going to help me out. And I'll talk about that here in just a second. But the old strings, there have been a few times when I've had, especially like a singer-songwriter come in and it's just an acoustic guitar and vocal, and they have old strings in their guitar, and maybe the song is kind of moody and dark, right? And so we don't want bright, snappy, happy sounding acoustic guitar strings. We want something just kind of lifeless and dull and kind of thuddy and kind of just there. And so that can actually really work out really well for some instances where you want to set a certain mood. So you might choose old strings in that case. Again, 98% of what I record, I like to have new strings. Most of what I record and write is going to be somewhere in the rock, pop area, somewhere in there. So I'm going to have drums, I'm going to have bass, I'm going to have guitars, usually multiple guitars going. I'm going to have vocals and maybe some other stuff going on. So that articulation from new strings is going to really help the acoustic guitar sit in a mix that's got a lot of other things going on, because your ear can pick up on that. That's what our ears can kind of pick up the best, is those high mids and stuff like that, where that articulation is. So that's going to help it sit in a mix better. Plus, with old strings, if you got all that mid and low mid stuff, that's going to just muddy up your mix. It's going to just kind of get boomy and all that stuff down there. Again, for a denser mix in general, rock, pop, all that kind of stuff, you're going to want new strings in your guitar. Now, a couple of cons of new strings. We kind of talked about some cons of old strings a little bit. Obviously, they're duller and all that stuff. But one con of new strings you might run into is that they're just squeakier, right? Especially if someone has bad technique and they're pressing down really hard. Every time they shift to another chord or something, and they just make a bunch of extra squeaks, right? Because our new strings are putting out more high-end frequency anyway, so that's where the squeak sound typically lives. So there's that, but also a lot of that squeak is coming from the friction between your fingers, probably, I guess, your fingerprint and the coils on the string. Your top strings don't really squeak. It's just the ones with the coils on them. And they squeak because there's a lot of ridges there. Now, your old strings are going to squeak quite a bit less in general, partly because they're not putting out that high in frequency as much, but also because there's just a lot of dead skin cells and dirt and oil and nastiness in between all those coils. And so it's kind of just a smoother glide across the strings, so it's going to squeak less. So if you have someone with really bad technique, it might be a good trade-off in some instances to lose a little articulation and high end from new strings and use older strings that maybe squeak less. But maybe sometimes you actually kind of want some of that squeak on here, because if it's, again, another singer, songwriter, just acoustic and vocal or something like that, that maybe just a little bit of squeak going on makes it sound much more natural, much more intimate, much more real, like you're right there with someone actually playing a guitar. So a little bit of squeak is not a bad thing. It can actually really work and actually kind of, again, set the mood as far as the song goes. Another con of new strings, or something to watch out for at least, is just tuning stability. So it depends on how you wrap your strings up here, but they might slip quite a bit for a while until you get all the extra slack out of here. So there are some ways of wrapping that are better than others for that. Another thing you might do is have locking tuners on your headstock up here. It makes changing strings easier, but it can also help with that initial tuning stability with that if wrapping is a problem. But also just the strings stretch a little bit as you play them. So one thing I always do is I have a string stretcher. If you run it up the string a couple times, that helps. And I'll usually kind of play hard open chords for a minute or two and kind of get a lot of that stretch out and then retune. And then between every single take, you're going to have to make sure you retune for each take, because they will stretch a little bit and they will fall out of tune a little bit. So just something to watch out for. Your old strings won't do that as much because they've already been stretched and all the slack's been taken out up here. So all that skipping and slipping and going flat has already happened. And so they're going to likely stay in tune better. All right, so let me know in the comments down below, did you prefer the new strings or do you prefer the old strings? And how often do you honestly change the strings on your acoustic guitar? I'm going to say I don't play acoustic a whole lot, and so I don't change them that often until it's time to actually record. So they may go 3 months, 6 months, or whatever without a string change. And then if I'm going to record something, I put new strings on. So let me know in the comments down below how often you change your strings. And if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful or interesting, make sure you hit like and subscribe. I got more videos coming out all the time about guitars, about songwriting, home studio recording, production, all that good stuff. So make sure you hit that like and subscribe for me. And if you happen to record electric guitars as well, maybe you live in an apartment and you got grumpy neighbors because, you know, the Marshall half stack is just a little too loud. Or maybe you work a full-time job and the only time you can record guitars is evenings and nighttime, and maybe you got kids and they're all asleep and you need to make some noise, but you can't. Make sure you check out my free guide, 5 ways to record loud guitars at home without waking the kids or upsetting the neighbors. It's stereolaunch.com/loudguitars, and I'll leave a link in the description down below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next one.